Julian Rothery, the Duke of Quantock, sat across from her in the dark, his face lit only by the swinging lantern outside the window. He did not look at her. He had not looked at her properly since the moment he arrived at her father's door 2 hours earlier, and announced, in a voice as flat as a closed ledger, that she would marry him before the week was over. "You have said nothing since we left," he said at last, his eyes fixed on the passing hedgerows. "What is there to say to a man who has bought me like a horse at market? I did not buy you. I am settling a debt. A debt I did not create." He turned to her then, and for the first time she saw something other than cold command in his face. It was hatred, old and deep, buried so long it had turned into something colder than anger. "Your father created it 30 years ago, when he stood beside my father and let him destroy everything my family had. You will not understand tonight, but you will marry me, and you will wear my name, and that will be enough to settle what is owed." Evelina had grown up hearing whispers about a feud between the Ashworths and the Rotherys, but her father had always waved them away as old gossip, the kind that clung to great houses like ivy on stone. She had never imagined the whispers would climb into a carriage and sit across from her, dressed in a duke's coat, waiting to marry her out of spite. "And what happens," she asked quietly, "when the debt is paid? Do you set me aside like a used contract? That is not your concern tonight." "It is entirely my concern. It is my life." He said nothing more. The carriage rattled on through the dark, past fields she did not recognize, toward a house she had never seen, to become a wife to a man who had made it clear, in the space of a single carriage ride, that he did not intend to love her. He intended only to win. By the time they reached Quantock Manor, the sky had turned the deep blue-black of true midnight, and the house rose out of the darkness like something carved from old bone. Its windows were mostly unlit, save for a single glow high in the west wing, a light that flickered and then, as though someone inside had noticed the carriage, went out entirely. Evelina noticed it. She noticed everything now. When a person's future had been decided by a stranger's cruelty, she had learned quickly that noticing was the only power left to her. A housekeeper met them at the door, her face carefully arranged into the practiced blankness of someone who had served this family long enough to know when not to ask questions. "Your Grace," she said to Julian, then turned to Evelina with a nod that was polite but distant, the way one might greet a guest one did not expect to stay. "This is Mrs. Halloway," Julian said. "She will see to whatever you require." "Whatever I require," Evelina repeated softly. "Or whatever you permit." Something flickered across his face, quick as a struck match, gone before she could name it. "Mrs. Halloway will show you to your rooms. The ceremony will take place tomorrow at noon. A magistrate has already been arranged. You have arranged my wedding before you arranged my consent. Your consent was arranged the moment your father signed the paper agreeing to my terms." There was nothing left to say. Evelina followed Mrs. Halloway up a wide staircase lined with portraits of Rothery ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track her as she passed, as though even the dead knew she did not belong here. At the top of the stairs, a long corridor stretched into shadow, doors closed on either side, until they stopped before one near the far end. "Your chamber, my lady," Mrs. Halloway said, opening the door onto a room grand enough to swallow her father's entire house. A fire had already been lit. A dress, plain but finely made, hung waiting on the wardrobe door for the following day. "Mrs. Halloway," Evelina said before the woman could leave, "why does the Duke hate my family so much?" The housekeeper's hand paused on the doorframe. For a moment, Evelina thought she might answer honestly. Instead, she simply said, "That is a story for His Grace to tell, my lady, if he ever chooses to." And then she was gone, and Evelina was alone, in a house full of strangers, about to become a wife in a marriage built entirely on someone else's old wound. She did not sleep. She sat by the fire until the flames burned low, turning over everything her father had refused to explain in the 2 hours before she was taken from her home. He had wept, actually wept, when he told her what she must do, but he had given her no details, only apologies, wrapped so tightly around themselves that she could not pull a single fact free. "It is the only way to save us," he had said. "The Duke has agreed to spare the family's name, if you accept the marriage." "I am sorry, Evelina. I am so sorry." "Sorry for what?" She had wanted to ask, but there had been no time. And now there was no one to ask, except a man who looked at her as though she were the embodiment of everything he despised. When morning came, gray and quiet, Mrs. Halloway returned to help her dress. The gown was elegant but simple, without the joy that should have belonged to a bride. Evelina stood before the mirror and studied the stranger looking back at her, a young woman about to be married to a man who had told her plainly, without a flicker of shame, that this was not a union of hearts but an act of settlement. The ceremony took place in a small chapel on the estate grounds, attended only by the magistrate, Mrs. Halloway, and a handful of servants who stood at a respectful distance. Julian said his vows in the same flat voice he had used in the carriage, as though reciting terms of a contract rather than promises of devotion. Evelina said hers quietly, her voice steady even as her hands trembled at her sides. When the magistrate pronounced them husband and wife, Julian did not smile. He simply turned to her, took her hand for the briefest possible moment required by custom, and said, low enough that only she could hear, "Now it begins." "What begins?" she asked. "The reason you are here." He walked away, before she could ask anything further, leaving her standing alone at the altar, in a chapel that smelled of old stone and candle smoke, married to a man who had not yet told her the shape of his revenge, only that it existed, and that she was now bound inside it. That evening, at a dinner attended by no guests, only the two of them at a table long enough to seat 20, Evelina finally found her voice again. "If this marriage is punishment for my father's sins, then punish him. Why must I be the one who pays?" Julian set down his glass with deliberate care. "Because he took something from my family that cannot be returned to me by punishing an old man. But he can lose something precious in another way. He can lose you to a house that will never love you as he claims to. I would use you to remind him what it feels like to watch someone he loves suffer for a decision he made." "I am not suffering," she said, lifting her chin. "I am simply married to a man too consumed by hatred to see the person sitting across from him." For a moment, something almost like respect passed over his face. Then it vanished, replaced again by that careful, guarded coldness. "You may see me however you wish, Lady Quantock. It changes nothing." "It is Duchess now," she corrected quietly, "if we are speaking of titles correctly." The dinner ended in silence, and Evelina retired to her chamber alone, staring into the dark, wondering what exactly her father had done 30 years ago that could turn a man's heart to stone, and wondering, with a small and stubborn flicker of hope she did not yet understand, whether anything could ever turn it back. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm, the kind that comes when two strangers are forced to share a roof, a table, and a name, without sharing anything of themselves. Evelina rose early, before the house fully woke, and walked the gardens alone, learning the paths the way a prisoner learns the walls of a cell, memorizing every turn as though it might one day matter. Julian kept to his study for most of the morning, emerging only for meals, where conversation between them remained thin and careful, like ice on a pond that had not yet frozen solid enough to bear weight. He asked after her comfort. She answered that she was comfortable. He asked if the staff attended to her needs. She answered that they did. Neither of them asked the questions that actually mattered. It was Mrs. Halloway who first let something slip, on a quiet afternoon when Evelina had wandered into the kitchen garden and found the housekeeper cutting herbs for the evening meal. "You are handling all this better than most would," Mrs. Halloway said without looking up. "His Grace is not an easy man to live beside." "He is not a man who wishes to be lived beside at all," Evelina replied. "He wishes only to be endured." Mrs. Halloway's hands paused over the herbs. "He was not always like this, my lady. There was a time this house was full of laughter, before his father passed, before everything changed." "What changed?" The housekeeper's face closed like a door. "It is not my place to say." "You keep telling me that," Evelina said gently, as though the truth were a locked box, "and everyone in this house has been given a key, except me." Mrs. Halloway set down her knife and studied her for a long moment, something like sympathy softening her expression. "Some boxes are locked for good reason, my lady, and some are locked because opening them would hurt more people than it would heal." She said nothing further, and Evelina did not press. though the words stayed with her long after she returned to the house, turning over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by a stream. That evening, an unexpected event forced Julian and Evelina into closer proximity than either had intended. A letter arrived from Julian's aunt, Lady Wren Ashcombe, announcing her intention to visit within the fortnight to meet the new Duchess of Quantock, and to host a small gathering in her honor. Julian read the letter at the dinner table with visible irritation. "She will ask questions," he muttered, more to himself than to Evelina. "She always does." "About what?" "About us. About whether this marriage is what it appears to be." "And what does it appear to be?" He looked up at her then, and for the first time since the wedding, something like exhaustion crossed his face. A crack in the armor he wore so carefully. A marriage born of affection. That is what the world must believe. My aunt is not easily fooled. "Then perhaps," Evelina said, setting down her fork, "you should tell me what I am meant to pretend, so that I do not fumble the performance." "You are meant to pretend you are happy. That will require considerable talent, Your Grace, given the circumstances." A faint, unwilling twitch touched the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough that Evelina noticed it and filed it away. Another small piece of a puzzle she had not yet begun to understand. "You have wit," he said. "I did not expect that. You did not expect much of anything from me, I think. You saw only my name and my father's sins." He did not answer, but he did not look away either, and the silence between them, for the first time, did not feel entirely hostile. It felt, instead, like the pause before someone decides whether to speak an uncomfortable truth. The visit from Lady Wren arrived faster than either of them wished. She swept into Quantock Manor on a bright, blustery afternoon, a tall woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, who embraced Julian briefly, before turning her full attention to Evelina. "So you are the girl who tamed my nephew into marriage," she said, studying Evelina from head to toe with unhidden curiosity. "I confess I did not think it possible. Julian has been cold as winter stone since his father passed. Tell me, my dear, how did you manage it?" Evelina glanced at Julian, who offered nothing, no help, no warning. Only a carefully neutral expression that told her she was on her own. "I suppose," she said slowly, choosing her words like stepping stones across a river. "Some things cannot be forced. They simply happen, whether we are prepared for them or not." Lady Wren's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing, but then she laughed, a short, surprised sound. "Diplomatic, I like that. Julian, you have chosen well, whatever your reasons." "I am glad you approve, Aunt," Julian said, his voice carefully even. Over the following days, Lady Wren proved to be both a comfort and a danger. She was warm toward Evelina in a way no one else in the household had been, sharing stories of Julian's childhood, of a boy who once climbed the orchard trees until his father called him down, of a family that had, before its troubles began, been full of warmth rather than silence. But she also asked pointed questions, the kind that circled closer and closer to truths Evelina did not yet possess. "Has he told you why he chose your family?" Lady Wren asked one afternoon, as they walked together through the rose garden, out of earshot of the house. Evelina hesitated, unwilling to lie outright to a woman who had shown her genuine kindness, yet unable to reveal how little she truly knew. "He has told me it concerns an old matter between our families. He has not told me the details." Lady Wren's expression darkened, just slightly, like a cloud passing briefly over the sun. "Some matters are better left buried, my dear, but burying them does not always mean they stay buried. My brother, Julian's father, was not the man his portrait suggests. There were things he did, choices he made, that Julian has never fully understood, because he was too young when it happened, and too proud since to ask the right questions." "What choices?" Lady Wren studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much a stranger, however newly married into the family, deserved to know. "That is not my story to tell, Evelina, but I will say this. If you wish to understand your husband, you must understand that his anger toward your family may not rest on solid ground. Men often inherit their father's grudges without ever questioning whether those grudges were justly earned." The words settled into Evelina like a seed dropped into fertile soil, and though Lady Wren said nothing more on the matter before her visit ended, the thought took root and began, slowly, to grow. In the weeks that followed Lady Wren's departure, something subtle shifted between Julian and Evelina, so gradual that neither seemed to notice it happening until it had already occurred. He began seeking her out in the evenings, not for performance before guests, but simply to sit with her by the fire, exchanging small observations about the day, about books, about the strange habits of the household staff. She found herself, despite every reason not to, looking forward to those quiet hours. One evening, as a storm rattled the windows of the manor, Julian found her in the library, curled into a chair with a book she was not truly reading, her attention drawn instead to the lightning flashing beyond the glass. "You are not afraid of storms," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. "I have never seen the use in fearing something I cannot control," she said. "Better to watch it and understand its shape than to hide from it." He studied her for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his face. That is a rather brave philosophy for someone who did not choose the storm she currently finds herself standing in. "Perhaps not," Evelina agreed. "But I have decided that if I cannot choose the storm, I can at least choose how I stand inside it." Something shifted in his eyes then, a softness she had not seen before, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to escape her notice. "You are stronger than I expected," he said quietly. "You keep saying that, as though you expected nothing at all. I expected a girl who would weep and beg to be released. I did not expect someone who would meet my coldness with patience, instead of fear." "Patience is not the same as forgiveness, Julian," she said, using his given name for the first time since their wedding. "I have not forgotten how this marriage began." "No," he agreed, his voice low. "Nor have I. But I find myself, more and more, wishing I could forget it, if only for an evening." The confession hung in the air between them, unexpected and fragile, and neither of them moved to shatter it. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the library, for the first time since Evelina had arrived at Quantock Manor, the silence between them felt less like a wall, and more like the beginning of a bridge. Still, beneath the fragile warmth growing between them, Evelina could not forget Lady Wren's words, nor the locked room she had noticed on her very first night in the house, nor the way Julian's face darkened whenever anyone mentioned his late father. Something was buried in this house, some truth that had shaped Julian's anger long before she had ever entered his life, and she was beginning to suspect that understanding it might be the only way to save whatever fragile thing was beginning to grow between them. Autumn arrived at Quantock Manor with a hush that seemed to settle over everything, muting the gardens into shades of amber and rust, and Evelina found herself, more often than not, walking the long corridor on the west wing, where she had first noticed the light flickering on her wedding night. The door at the end of that corridor remained closed always, its brass handle polished by the same careful hands that dusted every other surface in the house, and yet it was the one door no servant ever entered. She had asked about it once, weeks earlier, and received only a clipped response from a young maid named Clara, who had gone pale at the question and hurried away without answering. She had asked Mrs. Halloway as well, and though the housekeeper had not turned pale, she had grown quiet in a way that Evelina had learned to recognize as its own kind of answer. "That room belonged to the late Duke," Mrs. Halloway had said finally, choosing her words with the caution of someone handling something sharp. "His Grace asked that it remain locked after his father's passing. I have never questioned him on it, and I would advise you do the same, my lady." But advice, Evelina had discovered over the months of her marriage, was easiest to accept when curiosity did not gnaw at her the way it did now. She had watched Julian slip toward that door on more than one late night, when he believed the household asleep, and she had seen him emerge sometimes near dawn, his face drawn and pale, as though he had spent the hours inside wrestling with something that left visible marks on his spirit, even if none appeared on his skin. One night, unable to sleep, she rose from her bed and made her way quietly through the darkened halls, drawn by something she could not entirely name, half curiosity and half concern for the man she was slowly, cautiously, beginning to care for, despite every reason to guard her heart against him. She found him standing before the locked door, not entering, simply standing, his hand pressed flat against the wood, as though he could draw something from it through touch alone. "Julian," she said softly, and he startled, turning to face her with an expression she had never seen on him before, raw and unguarded, grief laid bare in the dim candlelight. "You should be asleep," he said, though there was no real reprimand in his voice, only exhaustion. "So should you." She stepped closer, close enough to see the tightness around his eyes, the shadows that spoke of many sleepless nights before this one. "What is behind that door, Julian? Please, I am your wife. Whatever burden you carry, I would help you carry it, if you would only let me." For a long moment, he said nothing, and she thought he might simply walk away as he always had before, retreating into the fortress of silence he had built around himself since childhood. But instead, he exhaled slowly, and something in his shoulders loosened, as though a weight he had carried alone for far too long had finally grown too heavy to bear without help. "My father's study," he said quietly. "I have not entered it since the night he died." "Why?" "Because the last conversation we ever had took place in that room, and it was not a kind one. I said things to him I can never take back, and he said things to me that I have spent every day since trying to understand, and failing." He paused, his jaw tightening. "He died 3 days later, alone, in that very room, and I was too angry to have made peace with him before it happened." Evelina's heart ached at the rawness in his voice, the grief he had clearly buried beneath layers of coldness and control for years. "What did he say to you, that final night?" Julian's eyes met hers, dark with old pain. "He told me that everything I believed about your family, about the debt they owed us, was more complicated than I understood. He tried to explain something to me, something about a betrayal, but I was too consumed by grief over my mother's passing that same year to listen properly. I accused him of trying to excuse his own failures by blaming others. I told him I did not care what complications existed, that the Ashworths had ruined us, and I intended to see them answer for it one day." He closed his eyes briefly. "Those were among the last words I ever spoke to my father." "Julian," Evelina whispered, "perhaps it is time to finally hear what he was trying to tell you." He looked at the door for a long moment, then, slowly, reached into his coat and withdrew a small brass key, one Evelina had never seen him carry before. "I have kept this key on my person every day since his death," he admitted. "I have never used it." "Then let us use it now, together." He hesitated, torn between old wounds and the quiet, steady presence of the woman beside him, and then, with a breath that seemed to steady something deep within him, he turned the key in the lock. The door opened onto a room untouched by time, exactly as it must have looked on the night the old Duke died. Dust lay thick over every surface, undisturbed for years, and the air carried the faint, musty scent of old paper and cold ash. A large desk sat near the window, its surface covered with papers, left exactly where they had been abandoned, as though the room itself had been frozen in the moment of loss. Evelina stepped inside carefully, Julian close behind her, his breathing shallow, as though every step into the room cost him something. She moved toward the desk, her eyes scanning the scattered papers, most of them old correspondence and estate records, nothing that seemed to hold the answers Julian had spent years avoiding. Then her eyes caught on something tucked beneath a stack of ledgers, nearly hidden, a folded letter sealed with wax that had never been broken, addressed in a careful, elegant hand to someone named Reginald Ashworth. "Julian," she said quietly, lifting the letter with trembling fingers. "This is addressed to my grandfather." Julian's face went pale as he took the letter from her hands, turning it over to examine the unbroken seal. "This was never sent," he murmured. "My father wrote this and never sent it. Should we open it?" He looked at her, uncertainty and fear warring in his expression, the fear of a man who has spent years building his identity around a single story, terrified of what might happen if that story proved false. "If we open this," he said slowly, "we may find that everything I have believed about your family, everything that shaped this marriage, this entire vengeance I have carried since I was a young man, was built on something other than truth. Would that be so terrible?" Evelina asked gently. "To discover that your anger, all these years, was misplaced. It would mean you are free, Julian. Free from a hatred that has kept you locked away from happiness for longer than I have known you." He stared at the letter for a long moment, then at her, something shifting behind his eyes, a decision being made in real time. "Not tonight," he said finally, his voice rough. "I am not ready tonight, but soon. I promise you, Evelina, soon I will find the courage to open it." She did not push him further, understanding instinctively that some truths required a person to approach them at their own pace, however slowly that pace might be. Instead, she simply took his hand, the first time she had done so without hesitation since their wedding day, and together they stood in the dust and silence of the old Duke's study, the unopened letter resting on the desk between them like a held breath, waiting for the moment either of them found the courage to release it. They left the room together that night, Julian locking the door once more behind them, though something had changed in the manner of his locking it, less like sealing away a wound, and more like carefully preserving something he intended to return to. As they walked back through the quiet corridors toward their separate chambers, he paused outside her door, an unfamiliar hesitation in his posture. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not letting me carry that alone tonight." "You do not have to carry any of it alone, Julian. Not anymore, if you do not wish to." He studied her face in the dim candlelight, something unspoken passing between them, and then, before either of them fully understood what was happening, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering gently against her cheek. "I do not know what I have done to deserve your patience," he murmured, "given how cruelly this marriage began." "Perhaps," she said softly, "it is not about what you deserve, but about what we choose to build from here forward." He did not kiss her that night, though the air between them had grown thick with a tension neither of them named aloud. Instead, he simply held her gaze a moment longer, then stepped back, wishing her good night, in a voice gentler than she had ever heard him use, and disappeared down the corridor toward his own chamber, leaving Evelina standing alone, with her heart pounding, and her mind full of questions about what truths that unopened letter might hold, and what it would mean for both of them once it was finally read. Over the following days, the household seemed to sense a subtle shift in its master, though none of the servants could quite name what had changed. Julian smiled more often, small and unguarded smiles that vanished quickly but appeared nonetheless, and he sought Evelina's company with an eagerness that no longer felt like performance for the benefit of watching eyes. Mrs. Halloway noticed it too, catching Evelina's arm gently one afternoon in the hallway. "Whatever you have done, my lady," she said, "the house feels warmer for it. I have not seen the Duke smile like that since before his father passed. I have done very little, Mrs. Halloway. I have simply tried to be patient." "Patience is not little, my lady. Patience is often the hardest thing a person can offer another, especially a person as guarded as His Grace." The housekeeper's eyes softened. "I hope, whatever happens, that you two find your way to something good. This house has held too much sorrow for too long." Evelina thought of the sealed letter resting in the old Duke's study, waiting for the courage neither she nor Julian had yet fully found, and she hoped, with a quiet intensity that surprised her, that Mrs. Halloway's wish might one day come true. Winter arrived early that year, dressing the estate in a fine layer of frost that clung to every window and turned the gardens into glittering silver fields. Inside Quantock Manor, however, a different kind of thaw had begun, slow and cautious, as Julian and Evelina continued to circle the truth waiting for them in the locked study, neither quite ready to face it, yet both increasingly unwilling to remain apart from one another. Their days had settled into something Evelina had not expected to find in a marriage built on vengeance, something resembling genuine companionship. Julian began joining her on her morning walks through the frozen gardens, offering his arm without being asked, his conversation shifting from clipped formality to something warmer, occasionally even playful. He told her stories of his childhood, careful ones at first, testing whether such openness would be met with kindness or mockery, and finding only the former, he began to share more. "My mother used to say, the roses in the East Garden bloomed later than anywhere else on the estate, because they were stubborn, just like me," he told her, one frosted morning, gesturing toward the bare, thorny stems that would, come spring, burst into color. I did not understand as a boy why she found that amusing. I understand it rather better now. "You are calling yourself stubborn, Julian." "I am admitting it before you accuse me of it," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in something close to a genuine smile. "Better I claim the fault myself than have you discover it and hold it against me." "I have already discovered it," Evelina said, laughing softly, the sound surprising even herself with how easily it came now, compared to the tension of those first cold weeks. "I simply chose not to mention it, out of respect for your pride." "My pride thanks you, then, for its brief reprieve." Such exchanges had become common between them, small moments of warmth that built, brick by careful brick, into something that felt increasingly like the foundation of an actual marriage, rather than the hollow arrangement it had begun as. Yet beneath every conversation, Every shared laugh, every lingering touch of hands as they walked, the sealed letter remained, waiting in the darkness of the locked study. An unresolved question neither of them could fully ignore, no matter how much happiness grew around it. It was Lady Wren's return visit, unannounced this time, that forced the matter back into sharper focus. She arrived on a gray afternoon, with barely any warning, sweeping into the manor with her usual brisk energy, though her expression carried something more serious than her previous visit had shown. "I have heard troubling news," she announced, once she and Julian and Evelina had settled in the drawing room, tea growing cold and forgotten between them. "There are whispers circulating among certain circles in town, whispers about old debts and old grudges resurfacing. I believe someone has been asking questions about the circumstances of your father's death, Julian, and about his dealings with the Ashworth family." Julian's expression darkened immediately. "Who is asking these questions?" "I do not know precisely, but the timing concerns me. Whoever is asking seems to know more than mere rumor should allow. It is possible someone has learned something that was meant to remain buried." Evelina's mind went immediately to the sealed letter, still resting untouched in the study, and she wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air, whether its existence had somehow become known beyond the walls of this house. "Aunt Wren," she said carefully, "do you know anything more specific about what happened between the old Duke and my grandfather? You mentioned before that there were things Julian did not fully understand." Lady Wren's gaze shifted between the two of them, weighing something in her expression, and then, with the air of someone finally deciding to unburden a secret she had carried too long, she set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap. "There is a reason I have never spoken plainly of this, Julian. My brother asked me, before he died, never to reveal what truly happened unless I judged the time right. I believe, now, that time has come." "Tell us," Julian said, his voice tight with a mixture of dread and desperate need for clarity that had clearly been building in him for years. "Your father and Reginald Ashworth were once the closest of friends," Lady Wren began, her voice carrying the weight of memory long held in silence. "They built much of the family's early fortune together, through a shared investment in shipping ventures that, for many years, made both families exceedingly wealthy. But there came a point when your father, driven by ambition and by debts he had accrued through poor decisions of his own, made a choice that betrayed that friendship entirely." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "He diverted funds meant for a joint venture, funds that belonged partly to Reginald Ashworth, in order to cover his own private losses. When the venture failed, as it inevitably did without proper funding, it was Reginald who bore the public blame, since the records had been arranged, quite deliberately, to implicate him rather than your father. Reginald lost his standing, his fortune, nearly his entire reputation, while your father emerged from the scandal relatively unscathed, his own involvement carefully hidden." Julian sat frozen, his face pale as the truth settled over him like a physical weight. "You are saying my father ruined Evelina's family, and blamed them for his own crime?" "I am saying exactly that," Lady Wren confirmed gently. "Your father carried that guilt for the rest of his life, though he was too proud, and too afraid of what it would mean for his legacy, to ever confess it publicly. I believe, in his final years, the guilt began to consume him, which is likely why he attempted to speak with you about it before he died, though clearly he never found the courage to be fully honest, even in that final conversation." Evelina watched Julian carefully, seeing years of certainty crumble in real time across his features, the entire foundation of his anger, his marriage, his vengeance, revealed to be built not on justice, but on a lie his own father had constructed to protect himself. "All this time," Julian said quietly, almost to himself, "I believed I was righting a wrong. I married Evelina to punish a family that had wronged mine, when in truth, it was my own family who committed the wrong, and hers who suffered for it." "Julian," Evelina said gently, reaching for his hand, "you did not know. That does not undo what I have done. I took you from your home. I forced you into a marriage, built on a lie I did not even know I was telling, and your family suffered the consequences of my father's crime for 30 years, while mine prospered from his silence." His voice cracked with something raw and painful. "How can you sit beside me now, knowing this? Because you did not create this wound, Julian. You inherited it, the same way I inherited the shame my family carried without ever understanding why. We are both victims of the same lie. The question now is not what was done to us, but what we choose to do now that we know the truth. Lady Wren watched the exchange with quiet approval, though her expression remained solemn. "There is more you should know," she said carefully. "The letter your father left, the one you found in his study, I believe I know what it contains. He told me, in his final weeks, that he had written a confession, intending to send it to Reginald Ashworth, as an apology, and an attempt to restore what he could of the man's reputation before he died. He never found the courage to send it." "Then it is a confession," Julian said quietly. "Proof of the truth." "I believe so, yes." Julian sat in silence for a long moment, processing the weight of everything he had just learned, and then he rose from his chair with sudden determination. "I need to read that letter, tonight." "Julian," Evelina said, rising as well. "Are you certain you are ready?" "No," he admitted, his voice steady despite the admission. "But I have spent enough years hiding from truths I was afraid to face. I do not intend to spend any more." That evening, as the winter wind howled against the windows of Quantock Manor, Julian and Evelina made their way once more to the locked study, the brass key trembling slightly in his hand as he turned it in the lock. This time, there was no hesitation at the threshold. He walked directly to the desk, lifted the sealed letter that had waited untouched for years, and with a steadying breath, broke the wax seal that had held his father's final confession hidden from the world. The paper crackled as Julian unfolded it, his hands not quite steady, and Evelina stood close beside him, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his body, as his eyes moved across his father's handwriting for the first time in years. She did not read over his shoulder, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to him first, that whatever words waited on that page needed to reach him before they reached anyone else. He read in silence for what felt like a long while, his expression shifting through disbelief, grief, and something that looked almost like relief, the strange relief of finally understanding a truth that had haunted him without shape or name for years. When he finished, he lowered the letter slowly, his eyes glistening in the candlelight. "Read it," he said quietly, handing it to her. "You deserve to hear his words as clearly as I have." Evelina took the letter carefully and began to read the old Duke's confession, written in a hand that trembled with age and guilt in equal measure. "My dear Reginald," the letter began, "I have carried this weight for so long that I fear it has become part of my very bones, and I can no longer bear the silence that has separated us for these many years. You were my closest friend, the brother I never had by blood, and I betrayed that friendship in the worst possible way a man can betray another. When our shipping venture began to falter under debts of my own making, debts I created through my own reckless gambling and poor judgment, I made a choice I have regretted every single day since. I altered the ledgers to suggest the losses were yours, knowing full well the consequences that discovery would bring upon your family and your name." Evelina's voice caught briefly as she continued reading, Julian watching her with quiet intensity. "I told myself, in the moment, that I would find a way to correct the record eventually, that I would confess before the damage became permanent. But cowardice is a patient companion, Reginald, and it convinced me, year after year, that the right moment had not yet arrived. I watched you lose everything, your fortune, your standing among our peers, even the respect of men who once called themselves your friends, and I said nothing, because saying something would have cost me everything I had built on the foundation of your ruin. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not even know if this letter will ever reach you, as I find myself, even now, uncertain whether I possess the courage to send it. But I needed, at least once, to set the truth down honestly, so that somewhere, in some form, it might exist beyond the lies I have told for 30 years. You did not deserve what happened to you. My son believes, because I allowed him to believe it, that your family wronged ours. This is not true, and it has never been true. Whatever anger Julian carries toward the Ashworth name, he carries because of a lie I was too weak to correct while I lived. I pray that somehow, someday, this truth finds its way to those who deserve to know it, and that it brings you whatever peace my silence has denied you for so long. Your friend, though I have long forfeited the right to call myself such. Edmund Rothery, Duke of Quantock. Evelina lowered the letter, her own eyes wet with tears she had not expected. Tears for her grandfather's stolen reputation, for the years of shame her family had carried unfairly, and for the man standing beside her now, who had built his entire adult life around a hatred that had never belonged to him in the first place. "Julian," she whispered, "your father knew. He knew the entire time, and he let you believe a lie because he was too afraid to face the truth." "Yes," Julian said, his voice hollow with the weight of the realization. "And I let that lie shape everything I did. I married you out of a hatred that was never justified. I brought you into this house under false pretenses, believing I was owed some measure of justice from your family, when in truth, it is my family who owes yours an apology that can never fully repay what was taken. What will you do now?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter in her hands, as though it held the answer to a question larger than either of them had yet spoken aloud. "I must make this right," he said finally. "Whatever that requires. Your grandfather is gone, and my father is gone, and neither of them can undo what happened between them. But your father is still living, and he deserves to know the truth, and to see his family's name restored, whatever it costs me to accomplish that. Julian, restoring my family's reputation could mean exposing your own father's crimes publicly. It could damage the Rothery name in ways that cannot be undone." "Then it will be damaged," he said firmly. "I have spent years building my life around the lie that your family owed mine something. I will not spend the rest of it protecting a reputation built on that same lie, at the expense of the truth your father deserves to hear." Evelina studied him carefully, seeing in his expression a resolve she had not witnessed before, a willingness to sacrifice pride and standing for the sake of justice long denied. "And what of us, Julian? What becomes of this marriage, once the reason for it no longer exists?" He turned to face her fully then, setting the letter down gently on the desk, and reached for both her hands, holding them with a tenderness that felt entirely different from the cold formality of their wedding day months earlier. "Evelina, this marriage began as an act of vengeance, built on a foundation I now know to be false. But somewhere between that carriage ride and this moment, it became something else entirely, at least for me. I do not know when it happened, exactly, whether it was the night you found me outside this very door, or the morning you laughed at my admission of stubbornness, or countless small moments in between. But I know that whatever began this marriage no longer defines it, not for me." "What are you saying, Julian?" "I am saying that I do not wish for this marriage to end simply because the reason behind it has been proven false. I am saying that I have come, against every expectation I carried into that carriage months ago, to care for you deeply, and that if you are willing, I would like this marriage to continue, not as a settlement of old debts, but as a genuine union between two people who have chosen each other, freely, with full knowledge of the truth between them." Evelina felt her heart pounding as she searched his face for any hint of the coldness that had once defined him, finding instead only sincerity, raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before. "Julian, I came into this marriage believing you despised me for sins I did not commit. I spent months uncertain whether anything real could grow between us, given how it began. And now?" "Now," she said slowly, a small smile breaking through her tears, "I find myself standing in a dusty study at midnight, holding a letter that has finally set both our families free from a lie that shaped our lives without our consent, and I find that the man standing before me is nothing like the cold stranger who took me from my home. You are someone I have come to care for as well, Julian, more than I expected to, given how this began." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time, and then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture far more tender than anything that had passed between them before. "Then let us face what comes next together," he said quietly. "My father's confession, your father's vindication, and whatever consequences follow, we will face all of it together, as it should have been from the very beginning." They stood together in the old Duke's study long after the candle had burned low, the letter resting on the desk between them. No longer a secret waiting to be discovered, but a truth finally set free, to do whatever good or harm it might yet cause in the world beyond those walls. Neither of them yet knew how difficult the path ahead would prove, how many obstacles remained before the truth could be fully righted. But for the first time since their wedding day, they faced that uncertain future not as strangers bound by obligation, but as two people who had chosen, freely and honestly, to walk forward side by side. The decision to reveal the truth was easier made in the quiet of a candlelit study than it proved to carry out in the light of day. Julian spent the following week drafting and redrafting a letter to Evelina's father, Viscount Ashworth, uncertain how to deliver news that would upend 30 years of shame, with a truth that arrived far too late to undo the damage already done, yet not so late that it could not still matter. In the end, he decided the truth deserved to be delivered in person, not through the cold distance of a letter. He and Evelina traveled together to her father's modest estate, a house far smaller and plainer than Quantock Manor, worn by years of reduced circumstances that Evelina had grown up within without ever fully understanding their cause. Viscount Ashworth greeted them with visible surprise, his face lined with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent decades believing his own failures had cost his family everything. "Evelina," he said, embracing his daughter warmly, before turning a more cautious eye toward Julian. "Your Grace, I did not expect a visit." "Father," Evelina said gently, "there is something you must know, something that changes everything you have believed about the past." They sat together in the modest drawing room, and Julian, with a steadiness he had to consciously will into his voice, explained everything Lady Wren had revealed, and produced his father's confession, allowing the old Viscount to read the words for himself. Evelina watched her father's face carefully as he read, watching 30 years of quiet shame crack open into something raw and overwhelming. When he finished reading, the old man's hands trembled, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply staring at the letter, as though it might dissolve if he looked away. "All these years," he finally whispered, "I believed I had failed my family through my own poor judgment. I believed the shame was mine to carry, mine alone, earned through my own foolishness." "You carried a shame that was never yours, father," Evelina said softly, reaching for his hand. "Julian's father stole from you, and let the world believe you had stolen from him." The Viscount looked up at Julian, his eyes wet with tears that seemed to carry decades of buried grief. "Your father was my closest friend," he said quietly. "I trusted him completely. I never once suspected, even after everything, that he could have been the one responsible. I spent 30 years wondering what I had done wrong, wondering how I had managed our finances so poorly that it destroyed everything we had built." "You did nothing wrong," Julian said firmly. "My father did this. And I intend to make certain the truth is known publicly, whatever the cost to my own family's reputation. You deserve to have your name restored, sir, and I intend to see that it is." The old Viscount studied Julian for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, gratitude mixed with lingering caution. "This will not be simple, Your Grace. Revealing this publicly means admitting your own father's crimes before all of society. It could damage the Rothery name for generations." "I am aware of the cost," Julian said. "I have decided it is a cost worth paying, to correct a wrong that has gone uncorrected for far too long." It was in the weeks following that visit, as Julian began quietly arranging to make the truth known through proper legal and social channels, that trouble arrived from an unexpected direction. Julian's cousin, Edmund Cray, a man who stood to inherit a portion of the Quantock fortune, should the family's reputation and standing suffer significant damage through scandal, learned of the planned revelation, and arrived at the manor uninvited, his expression carrying none of Lady Wren's warmth. "You cannot be serious about this," Edmund said, pacing the drawing room where Julian had reluctantly agreed to receive him. "You intend to publicly confess your own father's crimes? Do you understand what this will do to the family's standing? To your position in society? To every advantageous connection this family has built over generations? I understand precisely what it will do," Julian said calmly, though Evelina, watching from her seat near the window, could see the tension in his shoulders. "It will restore a reputation unjustly destroyed, and it will finally set right a wrong that has poisoned this family's conscience for 30 years, whether we chose to acknowledge it or not. And if I choose to prevent this revelation," Edmund said, his tone sharpening into something closer to threat, "there are ways to ensure such information never reaches wider ears. Julian, I would rather not resort to such measures, but you leave me little choice if you insist on this reckless course." Evelina rose from her seat, unable to remain silent any longer. "Are you threatening your own cousin, Mr. Cray, to protect a fortune that was never rightfully earned in the first place?" Edmund turned toward her, his expression cold. "I am protecting a family name, Duchess, something you seem remarkably unconcerned about. given that your own family stands to benefit considerably from this scandal. My family stands to have its honor restored, Evelina said firmly. That is not the same as benefiting from a scandal. It is simply justice, long overdue. Julian stepped between them, his voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning. Edmund, I have made my decision, and no threat you make will change it. If you attempt to interfere with this matter through underhanded means, I will ensure the consequences fall entirely upon you, regardless of our shared blood. Edmund studied his cousin for a long moment, clearly recognizing the resolve in Julian's expression. And then, with visible reluctance, he inclined his head slightly. Very well. But do not expect my support when society turns against this family for airing its dirty history so publicly. You are making a grave mistake, Julian. One that will cost this family everything it has spent generations building. Perhaps, Julian said quietly, but I would rather lose everything built on a lie than keep even a single brick of it at the cost of another family's stolen honor. Edmund left the manor that afternoon with barely concealed anger, and though he made no further direct threats, Evelina could not shake a lingering unease about what he might attempt in the shadows, given how much he clearly stood to lose should the family's reputation suffer the damage Julian intended to bring upon it. That unease proved well-founded within a fortnight, when rumors began circulating through society at an alarming pace, twisted and exaggerated versions of the truth that painted Julian not as a man seeking to correct an old injustice, but as someone seeking to destroy his own family's legacy out of some petty grievance, while conveniently omitting any mention of his father's actual crimes. Evelina suspected, though she could not prove it, that Edmund's hand lay somewhere behind the spread of these distorted stories, seeking to turn public opinion against Julian before the actual truth could be properly presented. They are trying to discredit you before you can speak, Evelina said one evening, as they reviewed the mounting gossip together in the privacy of the library. If society believes you are simply attacking your own family out of spite, they will not listen when you finally reveal the actual truth. Then we must ensure the actual truth reaches them first, clearly and undeniably, Julian said, his jaw set with determination. I will call upon the most respected members of society directly, present my father's confession, alongside supporting evidence from the original shipping ledgers, which I have already begun locating in the estate's archives. I will not allow distorted rumors to bury the truth before it has a chance to be properly heard. Over the following weeks, Julian and Evelina worked tirelessly together, gathering old financial records, correspondence, and testimony from surviving associates of both families, who could corroborate the details laid out in Edmund Rothery's confession. It was exhausting, often disheartening work, made more difficult by the persistent whispers circulating against them. But Evelina found, through the shared struggle, that her bond with Julian deepened in ways that no amount of quiet fireside conversation alone could have accomplished. You do not have to do this, Julian said one late evening, finding her still awake, poring over old ledgers by candlelight. This burden was never yours to carry. It is my family's crime to answer for. It became my burden the moment I married into this family, Evelina said gently, and it became my father's burden 30 years before that, through no fault of his own. I intend to see this through, Julian, not out of obligation, but because I believe, as you do, that the truth deserves to stand, however difficult the path to reaching it. He watched her for a long moment, something like wonder softening his tired features. I do not know what I did to deserve a partner as steadfast as you, given how poorly I treated you when we first met. You did not treat me poorly out of cruelty, Julian. You treated me poorly, out of a wound you did not fully understand yourself. I have come to see the difference, and I have come to forgive the man who carried that wound, because I have watched him grow into someone willing to sacrifice everything to correct it. Their efforts culminated, several weeks later, in a carefully arranged gathering at Quantock Manor itself, attended by the most influential figures in society, including several who had spread the distorted rumors against Julian. Curious to see how he would answer the accusations swirling around him, Julian stood before the assembled guests with quiet dignity, Evelina at his side, and began to speak the truth plainly, laying his father's confession before them, alongside the corroborating evidence he and Evelina had gathered through weeks of tireless effort. The room fell into stunned silence as the full weight of the old Duke's betrayal became clear. 30 years of assumed guilt suddenly and irrevocably overturned. Some faces in the crowd showed genuine sympathy, Others clear discomfort at witnessing a family so publicly confess its own historical wrongdoing. But as Julian continued speaking, calmly and honestly, without excuse or self-pity, Evelina watched the tide of opinion in the room slowly begin to shift, understanding and respect replacing the suspicion that had gathered against him in recent weeks. Edmund Cray stood near the back of the gathering, his expression carefully neutral, though Evelina caught the flash of frustration in his eyes as he realized his attempts to discredit Julian, before the truth could emerge, had ultimately failed against the sheer weight of honest evidence, presented without apology or evasion. In the days following the gathering, the transformation in public opinion continued to unfold, though not without complications that neither Julian nor Evelina had fully anticipated. Word of the confession spread quickly through society, and while many admired Julian's courage in publicly exposing his own father's wrongdoing, others whispered that no family could survive such a scandal untouched, regardless of the honesty behind its revelation. Viscount Ashworth, Evelina's father, found himself suddenly the recipient of sympathy and respect he had not known in 30 years, invitations arriving from families who had once distanced themselves from his company, now eager to make amends for decades of unwarranted suspicion. Yet the old man remained cautious, having learned long ago not to trust the shifting winds of society's favor too quickly. "They abandoned me swiftly enough when the scandal first broke," he told Evelina during a quiet visit shortly after the gathering. "I find myself unable to fully trust their sudden warmth now that the truth has emerged in my favor." "You do not owe them your trust, father," Evelina replied gently. "You owe yourself only the peace of knowing the truth is finally known. Whatever they choose to do with that knowledge is theirs to answer for, not yours." Meanwhile, Edmund Cray, having failed in his attempt to discredit Julian before the truth could be properly presented, shifted his strategy toward a more dangerous approach. Evelina learned of it first through Mrs. Halloway, who arrived at her chamber one morning with an expression of genuine alarm. "My lady," the housekeeper said, closing the door carefully behind her, "I have heard troubling news from one of the stable hands, who overheard a conversation not meant for his ears. Mr. Cray has been meeting with certain gentlemen known for handling matters of a less than honest nature. I fear he intends something more drastic than mere gossip to protect his inheritance." "What sort of matter, Mrs. Halloway?" The housekeeper's face grew graver still. "I do not know precisely, my lady, but the stable hand mentioned overhearing talk of contesting the legitimacy of the current Duke's inheritance itself, questioning whether Edmund Rothery's confession, being unsent and undelivered during his lifetime, holds sufficient legal weight to alter the family's official historical record, and by extension, potentially the very legitimacy of Julian's claim to certain properties tied to the original shipping venture." Evelina's stomach twisted with unease as she absorbed the implications. If Edmund Cray could successfully argue that the confession lacked legal standing, he might attempt to use the resulting confusion to challenge Julian's inheritance directly, potentially seizing control of significant portions of the estate for himself, under some legal technicality neither of them had yet considered. She brought the news to Julian immediately, finding him in his study reviewing correspondence related to the ongoing restoration of the Ashworth family's reputation. His expression darkened as she relayed what Mrs. Halloway had discovered. "Edmund would truly attempt something so drastic," he said quietly, more statement than question. "I should not be surprised. He has always resented standing second in line to inherit, and this scandal, however honestly handled, has given him an opening he clearly intends to exploit. What can we do?" Julian considered the problem carefully, his expression shifting from alarm into the focused determination Evelina had come to recognize as his response to any serious threat. "I will consult with the family solicitor immediately to ensure our position regarding the inheritance is unassailable, regardless of any technical arguments Edmund might attempt to raise. But more importantly, I believe we must move quickly to formalize matters with your father's family, perhaps through some legal arrangement that further solidifies the restoration of the Ashworth reputation in a manner that cannot easily be challenged or undone." Over the following days, Julian worked closely with his solicitor and with Evelina's father to establish clear legal documentation restoring the Ashworth family's rightful claim to damages resulting from the original fraud, ensuring the matter rested on solid legal footing rather than simply the moral weight of a confession alone. The process proved tedious and occasionally tense, particularly when Edmund Cray attempted, through his solicitors, to formally challenge certain aspects of the inheritance, arguing that the entire matter had been improperly handled and demanding a formal legal review of the Quantock estate's holdings. The matter ultimately came before a private legal proceeding, attended by representatives from both families, along with several respected members of society, who had taken a particular interest in how the dispute would be resolved. Julian presented his case calmly and thoroughly, supported by the original confession, corroborating financial records, and testimony from Lady Wren regarding her brother's final confessions before his death. Edmund Cray, for his part, argued vigorously that an unsent confession held no legal weight, that the entire matter amounted to nothing more than a story constructed to satisfy personal guilt or romantic sentiment, insufficient grounds for altering established inheritance and reputation. For a tense afternoon, the outcome remained genuinely uncertain, the presiding magistrate weighing arguments from both sides with careful deliberation. It was Evelina, ultimately, who provided the decisive testimony, describing in clear and steady detail the process by which she and Julian had discovered the letter, the corroborating evidence they had subsequently gathered from independent financial records that matched precisely the details described in the confession, and the consistent testimony of Lady Wren, who had heard the truth directly from her brother's own lips before his passing. "This is not merely a matter of one letter," she told the assembled proceeding, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "It is a matter of independent evidence, gathered honestly and thoroughly, all of which points toward the same undeniable truth. My family suffered 30 years of unjust shame, because of a crime committed by someone else. I ask only that the truth, now fully documented and corroborated, be allowed to stand as it deserves to." The magistrate, after careful consideration, ruled in favor of upholding both the restoration of the Ashworth family's reputation and Julian's rightful claim to his full inheritance, dismissing Edmund Cray's challenge as lacking sufficient legal grounds to overturn evidence so thoroughly corroborated. Edmund left the proceeding in visible frustration, though he offered no further public challenge to the ruling, apparently recognizing that continued opposition would only further damage his own standing in society. That evening, as Julian and Evelina returned to Quantock Manor together, the weight of months of struggle finally beginning to lift from their shoulders, Julian turned to her with an expression of profound gratitude. "We would not have succeeded today without your testimony, Evelina. You spoke the truth with a clarity and steadiness I could not have managed alone. We succeeded together, Julian, as we have managed everything since that night in your father's study. This was never a battle either of us could have won alone." He reached for her hand as their carriage rolled through the darkening countryside, the same road that had once carried her toward a marriage she believed would bring only sorrow, now carrying them both toward a future neither of them could have imagined on that first cold night. "I find myself thinking often," Julian said quietly, "of how differently this all began, and how grateful I am that it did not end the way it began." "As am I," Evelina said softly, resting her head against his shoulder, as the manor's lights came into view ahead of them. "Whatever vengeance first brought us together, I believe something far better has grown in its place." Spring returned to Quantock Manor with a gentleness that felt, to Evelina, like the natural conclusion of everything the estate had endured through the long, difficult winter. The rose garden Julian's mother had once tended began to bud again along the east wall, stubborn blooms pushing through soil that had weathered frost and hardship alike, and Evelina found herself walking those paths each morning, with a lightness she had not known since arriving at this house, as a frightened, unwilling bride. The legal proceedings had concluded months earlier, but their consequences continued to ripple gently through both families' fortunes. Viscount Ashworth's reputation, once thoroughly restored through the undeniable weight of evidence and testimony, had brought a quiet resurgence to his own modest estate, old friendships cautiously rekindling, invitations extended not out of pity but genuine respect, for a man who had endured decades of unjust shame with dignity. He visited Quantock Manor often now, and Evelina delighted in watching her father and her husband slowly build a friendship neither could have imagined possible during that tense first meeting months earlier. Edmund Cray had retreated from society's notice following his failed legal challenge, choosing to manage his own smaller inheritance quietly, rather than continue pursuing a battle he had clearly lost, both legally and in the court of public opinion. Lady Wren reported occasionally that he remained bitter, though increasingly resigned to accepting the outcome, and Julian, for his part, showed no interest in pursuing further conflict with his cousin, content simply that the truth had prevailed, and that his family's legacy, though forever marked by his father's crime, now carried alongside it, the redemption of an honest confession, finally brought fully into the light. It was on one such spring morning, as Evelina walked the garden paths alone, lost in quiet thought, that Julian found her, carrying something small and carefully wrapped in his hands. "I have something for you," he said, a rare shyness coloring his voice as he extended the small parcel toward her. She unwrapped it carefully to find a delicate silver locket, engraved with a pattern of roses that matched, she realized with quiet delight, the very blooms now opening along the garden wall beside them. "Julian, this is beautiful." "Open it," he said softly. Inside, she found a small portrait, painted recently, depicting the two of them together, a likeness captured during a quiet evening she remembered well, sitting together in the library, as autumn rain fell outside the windows. "I commissioned it some weeks ago," Julian explained, wanting to capture something of what we have built together, separate from everything that brought us to this point. "I wanted you to have something that represents not the vengeance that started our marriage, but the choice we have made since, to build something real from it." Evelina felt tears gathering as she studied the small portrait, moved beyond words by the gesture. "Julian, I do not know what to say. Say only that you are as happy as I am, standing here in this garden, having survived everything that tried to keep us apart these past months." "I am happier than I have ever been," she said honestly, closing the locket gently and pressing it against her heart. "I came to this house believing I was walking into a punishment, Julian. I never imagined I would leave that carriage ride towards something that would become the greatest gift of my life." He drew her close then, and for a long moment they simply stood together among the blooming roses, the weight of everything they had endured finally settling into something peaceful rather than painful. "I love you, Evelina," Julian said quietly, the words carrying a sincerity that had grown, slowly and honestly, from the coldest possible beginning, into something neither of them had dared hope for during those first uncertain weeks of their marriage. Not out of obligation, not out of the strange twist of fate that first brought us together, but simply because you are the finest person I have ever known, and I consider myself the most fortunate man alive to call you my wife. "I love you too," Evelina answered, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling within her. "I have loved you, I think, since that night you finally let me stand beside you before your father's locked door, unwilling any longer to carry your burdens alone." They remained in the garden long after the morning had fully bloomed into midday, discussing quiet plans for the future, a shared hope of children who would grow up knowing nothing of the old feud that had once defined their families, only the love that had ultimately triumphed over it. Julian spoke of restoring the shipping ventures that had once bound their families together in prosperity, before betrayal tore them apart, proposing a genuine partnership between the Ashworth and Rothery names, built this time on honesty rather than deception, one that might finally fulfill the promise their grandfather's friendship had once held before greed and cowardice destroyed it. That evening, as they hosted a small gathering to celebrate the formal announcement of the renewed business partnership between their families, Lady Wren pulled Evelina aside with a warm, knowing smile. "I confess, my dear, when I first met you, I worried greatly for what this marriage might become, given how coldly it began. I have rarely been more pleased to be proven wrong. You played no small part in helping us find our way to the truth, Aunt Wren. I do not think we would have arrived here without your courage in finally speaking honestly." "Perhaps," Lady Wren said, "but the courage to build something good from that truth, that belonged entirely to the two of you. I have watched my nephew transform from a man consumed by inherited bitterness into someone capable of genuine warmth and joy, and I know that transformation belongs to your patience and your love, not simply to the resolution of an old family scandal." Viscount Ashworth, standing nearby with a glass raised in quiet celebration, added his own reflection as the evening wound toward its close. "I spent 30 years believing myself the architect of my own family's downfall," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined I would live to see that shame lifted, nor did I imagine the man responsible for lifting it would become the husband my daughter loves so completely. Life has a strange way of turning our deepest sorrows into unexpected blessings, if we are patient enough and brave enough to see them through." Julian raised his own glass in response, his arm settled comfortably around Evelina's waist, as the gathered guests looked on with genuine warmth. "To truth," he said simply, "and to the unexpected grace of finding love in the very place we least expected it, born from vengeance, yet redeemed entirely by honesty, patience, and the courage to choose something better than the bitterness we inherited. The gathering raised their glasses together, and as the toast echoed through the halls of Quantock Manor, halls that had once held only cold silence and buried grief, Evelina felt, with quiet certainty, that whatever difficult path had brought her to this moment, she would not trade it for any other beginning, knowing it had led her, ultimately, to a marriage built not on the debts of the past, but on the honest, hard-won love she and Julian had chosen to build together, one truth and one act of courage at a time. A year passed before Quantock Manor welcomed its next great change, and it arrived not as scandal or vengeance, but as quiet joy. Evelina discovered, on a bright morning in early summer, that she was carrying their first child, and when she told Julian the news in the same library where their fragile trust had first taken root, he wept openly, something she had never once seen him do, not even in the darkest hours of confronting his father's confession. "A child," he whispered, kneeling before her chair and pressing his forehead gently against her hands. "After everything this family has carried, after every burden inherited without choice, we will bring a child into a home built on truth instead of secrets. She will never know the weight we carried to reach this place," Evelina said softly, "only the peace we built from it." The following months brought their own gentle challenges, the ordinary worries of any expectant parents, rather than the extraordinary dangers of buried scandal and legal battles. Mrs. Halloway fussed over Evelina with open affection, and Lady Wren visited more frequently than ever, eager to share wisdom gathered from decades of watching the Rothery family through both its sorrows and its joys. Viscount Ashworth, too, found new purpose in those months, throwing himself into the renewed shipping partnership with an energy Evelina had not seen in him since childhood memories she could barely recall. The venture prospered honestly this time, built on transparent ledgers and mutual trust rather than the hidden greed that had once destroyed it, and profits began flowing steadily back into both families' fortunes, repairing decades of quiet hardship the Ashworth household had endured without complaint. Edmund Cray, upon hearing news of the child's coming arrival, sent an unexpected letter to Julian, brief and stiffly worded, offering measured congratulations, alongside a cautious acknowledgement that perhaps the past year's disputes had run their course without benefit to anyone involved. Julian read the letter twice, before setting it aside with a thoughtful expression. "Do you believe he means it?" Evelina asked, watching her husband's face carefully. "I believe," Julian said slowly, "that even bitterness eventually grows tired of feeding itself, when it finds nothing left to consume. Perhaps this is Edmund's way of finally releasing a grudge that never served him well to begin with. I do not require his friendship, Evelina, but I will not refuse an honest attempt at peace, should he ever choose to offer one more fully." Autumn arrived, and with it came the birth of their daughter, a healthy child, with her mother's steady gaze and her father's dark hair, whom they named Margaret, after Julian's mother, the woman whose stubborn roses still bloomed each spring along the garden wall. The household celebrated quietly, without the grand gatherings that had marked earlier milestones in their marriage, choosing instead an intimate joy, shared only among family and the closest friends who had walked alongside them through every difficult turn of the past year. Holding their daughter for the first time, Julian turned to Evelina with an expression of profound wonder. "I once believed this house existed only to hold grief and old grudges," he said quietly. "I did not imagine it could hold something as pure as this." "Houses are only as cold as the silence we allow to fill them," Evelina replied, smiling down at their daughter's small, sleeping face. "We have filled this one with truth instead, and truth, it seems, leaves room for love to grow in its place." As the years that followed unfolded gently around them, the Rothery and Ashworth names became known throughout society, not for the old scandal that had once nearly destroyed both families, but for the honest partnership and quiet integrity that had risen from its ashes. Julian often told their daughter, as she grew older, the story of how her parents' marriage began in vengeance and ended in love, not to dwell on old pain, but to remind her that even the deepest wounds inherited from the past could be transformed, through patience, honesty, and courage, into something entirely new. Evelina, for her part, kept the small silver locket close for the rest of her days, a quiet reminder of the moment she had chosen to see the man behind the coldness, and the truth behind the lie, and had found, in doing so, a love far greater than anything vengeance alone could ever have built. And when she thought back, in quiet moments by the fire, to that first terrifying carriage ride into the dark. She felt no bitterness toward the path that had brought her there, only gratitude for every difficult step that had ultimately led her home.